So with that, let me introduce Steve Levinson.
Thank you, Lyra, for that kind introduction. Thanks to the sponsors of this series. So today I'm going to talk about what we can learn about human nature in some very broad sense by looking at other cultures. But before I do that, I just want to make a few remarks about the peculiar age that we are in, with this rise right across the liberal democracies of xenophobia. What's sort of curious about it, xenophobia is always with us in one form or another, but what's curious just about the present rise of xenophobia is it's occurring in all the Western liberal democracies at a time of unparalleled prosperity, not evenly shared, it has to be said, but still, and it's unexpected in a way. This we see, of course, here in the States, and we see it also in Britain with the Brexit phenomenon, and the sentiment here that's expressed here is this sort of fear of the majority culture being overridden one way or another. And again, we see the same phenomenon here in the States. So one of the, I think the roots of xenophobia are multiple, and I won't go too much into them. But one of the clear roots is just sheer ignorance. And one way to see that ignorance is just an example of it is the confusion in the minds of the general population of Sikhs with Muslims, with disastrous results. And what's sort of ironic about this is, of course, Sikhs were the great anti-Muslim shock troops of 17th century India. And so to see this is really rather a shocking ignorance. And you see exactly the same ignorance in the UK. Now, you can see also this ignorance is expressed in this inverse relationship between familiarity with immigrants and an anti-immigrant vote. Again, you see this relationship, again, right across Europe and also in many parts of the States. So the less familiar people are with immigrants, the greater the fear. So it's in that context that I wanted to make some just remarks about the importance and the wonders of cultural diversity and what it all has to offer us. So it's good to just remember that of all the cultures in the world, Western culture is a sort of giant potpourri of borrowings from other cultures. And you can see that if you just think about the origins of our alphabet, of our mathematics, and indeed the three great religions of the book, from the Near East, and of the technological inventions that lie behind Columbus's trip to the States, so to America, to the discovery of America, the compass, and of course the gunpowder that made it all the conquest of the conquest by the West of so many places, actually. All of this comes from China, of course, in the early modern period. So, I think it's also important to understand that cultural evolution is just a wonderful discovery system. You can discover the most wonderful sort of solutions to existential problems. And we see that, for example, in the gradual evolution of good cultivars, which have taken millennia to, in the case of these two, for example, the removal of poisons from these plants, or in these, the hybridization of different species that has gone into getting a large cob of maize or a banana that's not full of seeds. So although these inventions take millennia, they are, of course, quickly borrowed. And we can see that in many ways. You can see it here. Of course, we are the great robbers of good inventions. And you see it in almost every domain. Good ideas have been borrowed from around the world. So, just to give you an example that really affects the bottom line and the jugular, as it were, think about drug discovery. Many of the fundamental drugs that we use today have come from other people's medicine cupboards. And so you think about morphine or the anti-malarials. And if you compare this to the incredible cost of just experimentally finding compounds that will turn eventually into decent medicines, astronomical costs. And so because of that, we still to this day rely on borrowing other people's drug discoveries that have come, in many cases, like well over 100 fundamental drugs that we use today, have come from ethno-medical sources, so small tribes and so on that have discovered herbs and other sources of medicines. And with still new ones coming in all the time from this source. So we should really, should be grateful to the cultural diversity for delivering all of these wonders to us. We should think these borrowings are not all material. Some of them are just ideas and practices. So the sexual revolution came about because anthropologists working in the South Seas, and Malinowski in the first instance, working in the Trobrians, explored human sexuality and noticed that adolescent sexual experimentation didn't lead to the disasters that everybody expected, but led to stable and very good human relationships. And so in the case of Malinowski, his findings went straight through into psychoanalysis and later into in the 1960s, surfacing again in writings in the sexual liberation movement. And we see it again in Margaret Mead, who fed directly into feminist literature. So these are just some examples of the ways in which we have, one way or another, benefited from fertilization, as it were, cross-fertilization from ideas and practices and discoveries in other cultures. Now I want to say something about just the extent of cultural diversity. Here you see a map of New Guinea with the major language families, which there are about 60. And I'm going to just rely for a moment on language as a kind of proxy for ethnicity. So it's a relatively, it's a very approximate proxy. So you can have two ethnic groups that speak the same language. So actually Sikhs and Hindu Punjabis would be a good example. So there's no shortage there's a mismatch between language and ethnic groups. However, it's still, I think, the best sort of proxy that we have. And because we know a lot about languages, we know that there are 7,000 of them. The green dots here is one for each of them. You can see that the languages are sort of concentrated in the tropics and the subtropics, and we know a lot about that. With these 7,000 languages are grouped into about 450 distinct stocks. So these are the largest language families that we were able to reconstruct. So these are languages that we know to be related. And so there are 450 groups where inside each of those groups the languages are related. But outside, we know nothing about the relationships between them. So that, and the time depth of these language families is generally the order of sort of between 5,000 and 10,000 years. So in deep time, perhaps there's more of these 7,000 are related, but we can't now find that out. It's not recoverable. But these 450 give us independent experiments in human existence, as it were. And so that's a good thing to remember, that there are many independent experiments in a way in culture and language around the world. It's important to realize that most of this diversity is in very small groups. So over 80% of languages have less than 100,000 speakers, and the modal language, the most common type of language, has between 1 and 10,000 speakers. So actually, the sort of reservoir of cultural diversity are these very small groups around the world. And of course, they're very vulnerable, a point I'll come back to. Okay, so how can we learn from these 7,000 experiments in how to live? I think there's a nice popular book by Jared Diamond that points out many of the dimensions that we might look to. For example, modes of child rearing, ways of looking after old people, dispute settlement, diet and health. All of these things you can find out a lot about, other potential ways of doing things by looking at these other cultures. So now, what I'd like to now do is sort of mentally transport you to just one of these small groups. It's one of those independent experiments off in the Pacific. And here's the map of New Guinea with Australia at the bottom here. And I take you to this island called Russell Island, which is about 250 nautical miles offshore of New Guinea. And you can only get there in a boat. It takes you about 4 days. There's no airstrip or any other way to get there. So because it's cut off, relatively cut off, that it's, to some extent, to a large extent, not felt the waves of globalization that have obviously taken over many other parts of the world. It's a small island with just 6,000 people there. They all speak the one language. It's called Yelitnya. And it's a language that's not related to any other language in the world. It has sounds that are not known from any other language in the world. Just to give you an example, this is the word for girl. The initial consonant there is and very complicated sound and unique for this particular language. It has an enormous grammatical complexity, and I won't take you there because it starts to get very technical, but it has a unique grammatical system. The whole way in which the grammar is organized is not found in other languages. It's also an extremely irregular language. As a result of this, people who weren't born there find it almost impossible to learn. So people who married in, for example, hardly ever learn the language properly. Okay, so now, I'll just tell you something about the subsistence system. So this is common to most of the Pacific Islands, actually. So basically, they chop down a bit of virgin jungle and plant some tubers, and they're completely self-sufficient. They can look after themselves. Of course, they're glad of various imports, and particularly things made of steel, nails, knives, machetes, and so on. But they can survive perfectly well without imports. For protein, they rely on the sea, and they know a fantastic amount about the sea. There are, in this part of the ocean, there are about 1,500 tropical fish. And here, for example, this is one fish species in its different stages of maturation. So tropical fish, change color, they change shape, they even change sex, and you can see that as they get older, they just turn completely different. The locals know, they know both that all of these fish belong to one species, and they have names for each of these stages.
They also know a great deal about the forest, which of course they use in all sorts of ways, including finding medicines of various kinds. And here, for example, you can see them building a canoe using wooden nails and a stone hammer, using an extremely hard wood that can be used essentially as if it was steel. So, political system is astonishing in the sense, astonishing to us, in the sense that there's no policemen, there are no chiefs. And so you end up with actually an almost crimeless world without any apparent authority. So how does this work? It partly works because there are people who are very influential. And they're influential by their oratorical skills and by virtue of the fact that they're good redistributors of wealth. And in most of the Pacific, actually, the whole point of property, here, by the way, they're just exchanging valuable stone axe blades. But in most of the Pacific, the whole point of property is not to acquire it and hold it, but to redistribute it. Because through redistributing it, you get influence and fame. And so every child learns to share, and they also learn to argue that patch, because if they are accused of doing something wrong, they better be able to defend themselves with verbal skill, and they can. So this is rather topical. 20 years ago, an amazingly huge cyclone hovered over this island, just like Harvey hovered over Houston, and did an amazing amount of damage. So it wiped out all the food crops. There wasn't a single green leaf left on this island. This tropical island was, because of salt spray, right up to 1,000 meters. So as a result of there being no leaves, there were plagues of caterpillars, because the caterpillars didn't have the tree leaves to eat anymore. And so if you tried to plant anything, it would immediately get eaten. So it was actually a total disaster. And the reef was covered with sand, so there were no fish to eat. They would have been absolutely, well, they would have died, actually, had it not been for the fact that, by consensus, they requisitioned all the surviving sago trees, which can be converted into a edible starch. So everybody's body was put to work to turn these trees into starch, and they produced food which lasted them the 6 months until they managed to slowly recover. So the political system, it's there, it works, even though it's quite puzzling. They, by the way, are cyclone-adjusted folks. Every village has a cyclone house like this, a cyclone shelter, which resistant to massive winds, because they get them about every 10 years. They get a massive cyclone. So I just wanted to make this point. It's been very controversial as to whether humans have adapted through group selection, which means that by a process of not just individual survival of the fittest, but also group survival. And I think if you think about something like this and this kind of cyclone reaction, it's rather clear that humans, by acting as collectivities, do survive as groups. This is my scribbled genealogy from one guy. It actually runs to, it's a great scroll that has about 9 of these sheets. And on it, there are about 600 names. And so this is one guy's genealogical knowledge. It goes 10 generations deep. And it's a vast, if you think about it, it's 600 people. He knows the relationship between 600 people and everybody else. It's a massive sort of network that he is completely in control of. And it's a system that is complicated by the fact that, so this, of course, determines what kind of kin terms you can use to people, how you address them, how you talk to them, and talk about them. And there are about 50 such kin terms in this language. It's actually very complicated to use this terminology because the terms they go in alternating generations. You can maybe see this here across genealogy. So it's a complicated system. But a kid of 10 will master this system. So that's also kind of very interesting mental gymnastics. They have an elaborate Olympiad of gods. They're thoroughly missionized these days, but nevertheless, the old gods still survive. And there's a mythology that rivals the Greek myths for its interest and complexity. So they have no representational or visual art. And sometimes people, for example, archaeologists used to argue that Neanderthals couldn't have, were subhuman essentially because they had apparently, or no visual art from them has survived. But as you can see, I think, from this kind of example, that is not a good condition, as it were, for being human. So, and they also have no sort of technology of applied color. And as a consequence, they have a very primitive, only sort of half-baked color system. So here's a color chart, and of most of it, they have no names, no way to describe it at all. And what names they have are, if you like, kind of metaphoric. So what they do have is a very elaborate verbal art. So many, half a dozen major genres of song. What's interesting in ethnomusicologists is they have absolutely no musical instruments, and they don't even use percussion. So that is a very unusual feature, not reported actually elsewhere, but perhaps it's more common than we know. There they are singing. So child rearing is interesting because children, as actually many of these small groups, are wonderfully poised little individuals. They are very well adjusted, brave and helpful, and also just very competent. So you see them being given these very long messages to carry across the mountain to a relative on the other side. And they're tested just to make sure they've got it verbatim, and then they're off they go. So they're sort of treated as mini adults, and they run around and forage a lot for themselves, collecting nuts, for example, many of which have to be processed by elaborate procedure to render them edible. So they have to be baked and then leached for 10 days in a river and that sort of thing. So they're very able to do all of these things. And this little kid here has just performed in an all-night song fest, a sort of opera, light opera, and he had to learn 30,000 words in just 10 all-night rehearsals. So, and he has to do that because he has to be able to do it solo. Any single point, somebody can pull him out and say, "Do it again," and because they love the way he sings. So also sort of a very impressive memory feat. Okay, so look, this is just one small ethnic group, but here you are with the language with unique properties, which really sort of changes our views about what a possible human language would be. They're potentially self-sufficient, but they've got this vast ethnobiological knowledge. You've got this social order without any authority, these 10-generation deep memories about their genealogies, elaborate mythology, no visual art, but elaborate verbal art, and so on and so forth. So the point I think I want to make is, look, this is just one of thousands of these small groups that harbor many lessons for us, and they're just intrinsically interesting in and of themselves. Good. Now, I want to say something a little bit more general about what we might be able to learn about human nature by looking cross-culturally. And I should say just right away that when I use the words human nature, one immediately invokes the sort of nature-nurture dichotomies, and I think we've moved far beyond that these days, partly because of developments in epigenetics, the ways in which the environment actually affects the ways genes operate. Brain plasticity that we've discovered that the brain is much more plastic, much more able to learn new tricks than previously thought, and then the way in which during human development these factors play their particular roles. So, so when we're talking about human nature, I think what we're talking about is sort of constraints and affordances on different ways of being, different ways of thinking, and what we can use cross-cultural comparison to do is to sort of pinpoint the areas where humans are relatively flexible or relatively inflexible. You know, where they're relatively inflexible, we often talk about human universals, and where they're relatively flexible, sort of cultural specificities of one kind or another. And now I want to consider sort of three domains of cognition, three areas of thought. And so they're spatial cognition, sensory perception, and social interaction, and just give you little vignettes of what we can learn by looking cross-culturally in these domains. So first, space. So spatial cognition has been, thinking about space has been a major preoccupation of Western philosophy and Western science for a long time. So Newton introduced talk about absolute space. So he was the first person to actually introduce, it seems perhaps amazing to us now, but the first person to introduce the idea of space as a infinite void, as it were, potentially devoid of anything. An idea that took a look, people found hard to accept. One of the folks who argued against him was Leibniz, who argued that actually, space should be thought of as the relationship between things or places. So you can have a sort of network of relationships between things or places. So this was a relative conception of space, and Newton's was an absolute conception of space. These are the terms that have come down to us. Kant had a way of kind of combining these insights. So he held that we had intuitions of the Newtonian sort. We intuitively knew there was, space had these kind of infinite properties. But in fact, for practical purposes, we thought about space in terms of the relations between things. And in particular, we think about space in terms of the relationships between the facets of our body. So we think about space, things being to the left of us, to the right of us, behind us, or in front of us. And Kant expressed this very clearly here in this quote. But and this view became embodied in most of Western thought about the cognition of space. So, if you like, space is embodied for us. We think about it in terms of our body. That has been the classical view. I had the privilege of working with Australian Aboriginals in northern Queensland, with a group that had been previously researched by John Haviland, and this is a group where people think and talk about space in terms of north, south, east, and west, and this is insistent in the language. So about 1 in 10 words is one of these cardinal direction terms. So north, south, east, and west, and then it's supplemented with gestures, which are veridical in the sense that when they point somewhere, they mean exactly there. And what's interesting about these folks is that they have no terms for left or right. They have a term for weak hand and strong hand, but they have no
use of these terms as, as descriptions of regions, of spatial locations. So these are, if you like, anti-Kantian folks. That's just not the way they think. They're Newtonians in their conception of space. So we went on and did quite a lot of work on what are called frames of spatial reference. So these are coordinate systems that people use to describe where one thing is with its relationship to another. And so if you wanted to, for example, to say, where the ball is in relation to the chair here, there are lots of different, well, actually there's three main classes of solutions, and then a number of subclasses, which we won't go into. The three main classes are these. The first is the sort of Kantian solution. So we import our body axes with us, and we're going to describe that ball as being to the right of the chair. Another solution is to imagine the chair as having intrinsic coordinate system of its own, in which case we can talk about the ball being in front of the chair. And a third solution is to imagine the kind of gradient in the environment, and then we can talk about the ball as being west of the chair, as appropriate. And so these are the three main classes of solution, cross-linguistically. And I'll concentrate particularly on the relative one, that's the left-right one, and the absolute one, the north-south one. So what we have noticed is that the distribution of these different ways of talking is not random. So hunter-gatherers, foragers, tend to use this absolute system, the north, south, east, west system. And that's because it's a better system if you're working in vast, pathless spaces. Whereas urban dwellers tend to use the left-right system because it's a better system if you're working in a sort of rabbit warren of cities. And of course, it affords literacy, traffic rules, and all sorts of other things. These systems are kind of highly practiced because we're all the time using one or other of the systems to describe where things are and to think about where things are. And they're also sort of built into the environment in the case of the left-right systems. And not all languages use all of these three. Some of them really preoccupied, like we are very much preoccupied with the left-right one. And the Aboriginals totally preoccupied with the north, south, east, west one. And this turns out to have really quite deep consequences on how people think about space. So let's just... so this is just a map of the different systems that we have investigated one time or another around the world. And I'll just take you to an example nicely studied that contrasts Dutch usage, which is just the same as ours, left-right type system, with a San hunter-gatherer group here in Namibia. And this work was done by Daniel Hown, who's in the audience somewhere, and a colleague, Christian Rappel. And so the group in question are the Haikom, who live in northern Namibia. They're scattered in lots of small groups around a large, huge area. And to investigate how people think about space, here's a very simple way. So you get people to observe a row of animals on a table. And you say, now remember the order. So they're different colored animals. Remember the order. And then you rotate them and make them reproduce the array on another table, but under rotation. And now there are two sort of obvious solutions to this. You either rotate your coordinates with you and think about the row as heading left like that, or instead you translate the array across the table and think about the array, the three animals as heading south or as appropriate. So
So Daniel did these very nice matched tests between the Dutch kids in a village. There's the Dutch school, and there's the school in Namibia, and with the table at one end of the schoolhouse and another table at the other end, and the kids were tested on one table. Well, they saw the array on one table and then taken right round to the other end of the building and tested on the other. And so they were 8-year-olds in both locations. So it was sort of really nicely matched in a little experiment. What did he find? Well, he found that the Dutch kids always did the animals in the left-right way. They always used their own embodied coordinates, whereas the Haikon kids always used, or nearly always, used the north-south solution. So now some folks, some colleagues had really doubted whether this could really be true, thinking that there would be one universal human solution to spatial cognition. So they thought, oh, this is just a skin-deep effect. So Daniel then pushed the kids to remember a much more complicated array like this. And so they saw this little array, then it was demolished, and they had to make the array on the table at the other end of the schoolhouse. This is the solution that you or I would do. This one is even a little bit mind-boggling, because you, in a way, you're imagining the array from the other side. Nevertheless, that's exactly what the Haikon kids do. Actually, they're even more resolute in their north-south solution than they were before. And then Daniel went on to see whether he could train the kids up to do it the other way, whatever the way which wasn't their customary way. Could he train them up? And the answer was no. They got more or less random results. So then he went on to do a study which, again, is a little bit mind-boggling. So he trained, with Christian, he trained up kids to do a very simple dance routine. And then, once they'd learnt it, rotated them, and you can just see a Haikon kid doing this. It's quite fun. It'll take a little moment because he has to train the kid up to do a little dance.
Okay.
So 1, 2,
3, 4. Haka, okay, nahoma. 3, mona, haka, okay, nanja, nahoma. 3, mona, haka, nanja, sasa, nare.
Now we've got to get the kid up to criterion, so definitely can do it.
3, mona, haka, nanja, you see?
Now he's rotated.
Nona, haka. Nanja. See, nokoba nare. Nona, haka. Kaya yoshi.
So, of all the things you would think you would, lay down in memory in terms of north, south, east, and west, doing a dance routine is the last thing that you would imagine. So I think it's a kind of astonishing evidence of, and Daniel went on to show that German kids, just do it the way you and I would. So, let me just summarize this little vignette about human spatial cognition. So human cognition in this domain isn't fixed, as people had thought. It is variable, and it varies largely in relation with the language and the ecology that language is adapted to. And that was certainly news to psychologists at the time. In fact, some still resist it because it has been quite shocking in a way to our views about universal human nature. But anyway, this is the kind of finding that one could only find out by looking cross-culturally. There isn't another way to do this. Let me just turn to another domain now. So sensory perception. So there's a feeling that we have different kind of conscious accessibility of the different senses. So, for example, for vision, we're able for shapes or for colors to name them easily. But if you come to olfaction and you try to kind of think about the names for different smells and so on, you very rapidly find you're out of room. And people have thought about this a lot and thought about, well, maybe this has to do with the fact that the way in which the olfactory senses are wired is directly into the sort of subbrain, whereas the vision is cortical. So olfaction is more limbic, goes into the limbic system. And so on the basis of this, folks have said things like this, that there's no semantic field of smells, it's a little special value across cultures and so on and so forth. So it's a sort of degraded sense is the view. Aristotle had a lot to say about this 2,000 years ago, and he had a kind of hierarchy of the senses, where the distal senses were the noble senses, and the base senses were the proximal senses, and we have sort of conscious accessibility to the distal senses, but much less so to the proximal ones he held, and the proximal ones were therefore sort of ineffable. We lacked a sort of terminology for them. And so we were interested in whether actually this holds up cross-culturally. So along with Asfa Majid, we ran a kind of big cross-cultural study which involved a lot of people with 23 languages around the world and with a systematic set of stimuli for the different senses. And what the questions that we were asking is, how do people actually describe a particular sense stimulus? So are there words at all? Are they abstract words like sweet or red? Are they source-based like sugary or orange? Or are they evaluative, like nice? And then we also went on to ask, and I'll concentrate on this, are they consistently used? Are people able to, in a community, to consistently describe a sense stimulus, with one particular term, like red? So for English, this is a codability hierarchy, so just an index of the way to which, the extent to which a particular sense stimulus is codable. And this is color stimuli, and here are shape stimuli, so two visual stimuli, types of visual stimuli. These were auditory stimuli, so loud sounds, soft sounds, high sounds, low sounds, long and short, and so on. And then there were tactile stimuli, rough and smooth, and so on, and basic taste stimuli, and then smell stimuli. So these kits were carried around the world, off to different ethnic groups. So as you can see, the English codability hierarchy pretty much fits the Aristotelian presumption. So the vision is top, audition second, and then you've got these distal senses being somehow less codable. This is the results of the 23 languages. You won't be able to see very much here, but there's English on the bottom here, and what you can just see is that not all languages look the same at all. And I'll just sort of expand. There's English again, just for reference, with the Aristotelian hierarchy. So here's Rossel Island, Yelitnia, that island I was talking about at the beginning, and you can see it's got a completely different sort of inverse, almost inverse hierarchy. So overall, what we found is that many languages, in many languages, taste outranks vision for codability. Hearing is surprisingly ineffable in many languages. And smell, it's true, is mostly poorly coded, and you can see that here. But there are some amazing exceptions. And so I'll just take you to one of them. So this is a study by Asfer Majid and Nicholas Bernholt, and of odor coding in a language called Jahai. Jahai is a hunter-gatherer language, one of a number of the Aslian languages, spoken here in Malaysia by a group of just about 1,000 hunter-gatherers living in the tropical jungle here. And what they found was that these guys have abstract smell terms that describe odorous factors that are very unobvious. For example, so here this plant and soap and a bear cat here and durian fruit are all thought to have this, essentially the same odor, or at least could be categorized as having the same odor. And Het here describes shrimp paste and tiger smell and fresh rubber smell. Pu'us here, hornbill and a particular species of mushroom and boiled cabbage and so on, all sharing these. So odor factors here, very unobvious to us exactly what lies behind it. But they're able to systematically use these terms, and people understand what they mean. So they clearly have a descriptive vocabulary for smell. They have about 15 of these terms. If you just go back, take us back to that sort of comparative study, then you can see that here's English with the codability of color versus odor, and now you compare Jahai, and you can see that for them, although their performance is not as strong because they're non-literate peoples working, no, used to being tested the same way, but you can see that for them, odor and color are just as codable as each other. If you look at actually how we code these, you can see that that color in English is coded with abstract terms like red and blue. They don't mean anything else. That's what they mean. But for odor, we rely on sources. So we say lemon smell or smell of a rose. If you look at Jahai, though, they're using abstract terms for both color and smell equally. So it's a very different system, and the point is it's clear that there is a potential to have a purely abstract smell terminology. So neuroanatomy isn't going to determine sensual perception in the way that I think a lot of folks had imagined. It certainly doesn't fully determine sort of access to conscious discrimination and to language. And rather, each language has got its own codability hierarchy, and which is part of the of what's being transmitted over time by culture. It's part of the adaptation that a culture makes to its local ecology. My last vignette concerns interactive language use. And so here's a domain where folks have thought that language structure has a strong universal base. Chomsky is famous for holding this. In contrast, it had been thought by the ethnographers of speaking that there's a very wide cultural diversity in different uses of language, which is true as far as it goes. But if you invert these expectations, I think you get much nearer to the truth. That's to say, there seem to be actually, now we know a lot more about the extent of linguistic diversity around the world. We know that languages differ on every possible dimension. it seems that there are only weak structural biases as far as language structure is concerned, but there seem to be strong universal base for core language use. By core language use, I mean use of language in the interactional niche. This is conversational chat, if you like. This is the primary form of language use. It's the matrix for language acquisition. Before writing, of course, it's the primary, absolutely the primary use of language, and it still actually is the bulk of where language is used. It's strikingly similar across languages. There are many ways in which it's similar, which I can't go into, but for example, the way sequences of terms that talk are organized, so I ask you a question, you provide an answer, and so on. In very detailed ways, these are similar across cultures. Similarly, the way if I don't understand what you say, and I go, huh? Then that very word is more or less identical across languages, and so on and so forth. There are many ways in which this the kind of basic organization here appears actually really to be strong and universal. But I'm just going to look at the rapid turn-taking which characterizes this phenomenon. So when we're just chatting, we exchange turns at an amazing rate. Now, what's interesting about this is if you contrast this to language organization. So languages can be, we owe this to Chomsky, can be thought of as a kind of giant bridge from a sound system to a meaning system, where the bridge is a set of combinatorial possibilities. So languages vary in having either little as 12 sounds or as many as 140 sounds. They take those sounds and build parts of words, we call those morphemes, and the morphemes are built into words, and the words are built into sentences, and so that's all of the combinatorics that goes on. And the meanings, those operations are variable across languages, and the meanings that you get out at the end are variable across languages. So none of that looks remotely universal. There are 7,000 variants of that. But you look at this turn-taking, where A says something, B says something, A says something, B says something, A says something, B says something. That you'll see in language after language. You'll never see any difference in informal chat. That's how it works. What's interesting about this, actually, is the precision and speed of it. So sometimes there are longer gaps, sometimes there are short overlaps, but on the whole, we end up with a 200 millisecond gap. I say something, and 200 milliseconds later, you say something. And that is actually astonishingly fast. And it's actually very precise, but we needn't go into that. So we just checked this out on a worldwide basis, looking at 10 languages from 7 different language families with different word orders and so on. And you'll see exactly the same sort of graphs for response times across languages. Interestingly, it's even true of sign languages, where some of the same constraints of me speaking over you, masking what you're saying, don't hold, but still, you get exactly the same sort of pattern. So we sort of think that there's a deep kind of temporal metabolism here that is showing up in language after language, and could be a sort of ancient layer, as I'm suggesting, in sort of human communicative ethology. An interesting extra wrinkle on this is just that that actually the language production system is very slow by psycholinguistic standards, by psychological standards. So it takes you from the moment that you think of the word that you want to say till the moment anything comes out of your mouth, it'll take you 600 milliseconds, so well over half a second. If you want to say a short sentence like Mary kissed John or whatever, it'll take you 1.5 seconds. This is the coding time. This is how long the encoding takes in the mind. So if you plug those numbers back into Anne and Bob chatting here, what you can see is that that Bob here, in order to respond within 200 milliseconds, has got to have actually predicted the end of what Anne's done is, and then started coding up his response. It's the only way you can pull this off. And so this actually puts kind of a big, we know this from doing EEG and complicated things. So, but the question then arises, why do we have a system like this? Why do we have these generally very short turns, they're about 1 to 2 seconds usually, and then with a very short turnaround, and then we are cramming the most complex material into these short turns, which is pushing, the human cognitive system to its very limits. This is really tough stuff. We're, of course, very used to it, so we can do it. But it is a question sort of worth asking, and it does suggest there's some sort of modularity here. There are two systems. There's a turn-taking system, and then there's the language system, and somehow the language system has been gradually evolved on top of a pre-existing sort of temporal base. Now, you can get a little bit of evidence for this by looking at both the ontogeny and phylogeny of the system, so in human development and in development in evolutionary time. So here is a study of kids turn-taking from 3 months up to 3.5 years. And what you'll see here is that early on, kids are very fast. Now, these are infants, of course, they're not saying anything sensible, they're cooing and ahhing, but it's these vocal noises being done in response to mum, and the responses are fast. Once language kicks in, the whole system gets slow. And that's because, of course, the core kids are learning to do this feat of cramming complicated stuff into these short little turns. And in fact, kids don't catch up with adults until way into late middle childhood. So this again suggests, that somehow the two systems are a little bit independent. So the turn-taking system might have been there earlier. And by the way, we're just checking this out now cross-culturally, just to be sure about this, the developmental thing. This is a project being run by Marisa Casillas here. But now if you look phylogenetically, so now we look across the whole primate order, what you'll see is that this is patchy. That's to say, only a few species in a clade, a major branch of the family, will actually be a vocal turn-taker. But in every such branch, you can find vocal turn-takers. There they all are with the red stars, including us. What's interesting is that the great apes are not vocal turn-takers. They're not actually into voluntary vocalizations at all. But what they do is they have quite an elaborate gesture system. And those gestures have exactly the same temporal properties in turn-taking as the human turn-taking system. So it does suggest that that there is some kind of evolutionary story here. Anyway, so just to summarize that about the sort of universals of interaction, I think it would make sense to have such a sort of foundation for communication, to have this kind of fixed base, because kids can extrapolate from this fixed base. They can gradually learn the local language that's around them because they're already provided with a sort of fundamental temporal mechanism. And I think it also helps to explain then, how languages can vary as much as they do. And as I said, it offers some kind of phylogenetic precursors to language, which is, because language is always the great chasm between us and the beasts. But in actual fact, in this sort of way, I think you can see there are connections through to the rest of the primate order. So that's an unexpected finding, again, that came from cross-cultural research. So just to conclude now, I think that we should champion the gifts of cultural diversity in this xenophobic age, that every culture is a natural experiment in ways of being that's evolved over deep time, and it's got many lessons for us. And I think the sort of systematic comparison can help us to pinpoint ways in which human cognition is flexible in some respects and inflexible in others. And in this case, we've got diversity where we didn't expect it in space and perception, and we've got universals where we had expected diversity in verbal interaction. And so that just shows you, I think, how important the cross-cultural perspective is. But this window of opportunity for this kind of work is disappearing at a rapid rate, because the small groups, which are the reservoir of cultural diversity, are under extreme threat at the moment. It's hard to be sure of exactly what rate languages are disappearing, but estimates vary, in this sort of range, that by the end of the century, there will be, the most pessimistic is there will 90% of language and ethnic diversity will have disappeared. The most optimistic is that 50% of that diversity will have gone. Here's a map with the red dots are all the endangered languages at the moment. So language loss is a kind of index of, the loss of all of this cultural diversity. And it's really important that we use this sort of vanishing window into human nature while we're still able to. Thank you very much. I just want to thank my research group who made this possible.